It was while Michelangelo was working on the Medici tombs that he conceived the project for the Laurentian Library. Michelangelo used to say, "There can be no doubt that the limbs of architecture derive from the limbs of man." The prelude to the reading room is the vestibule. Here, the motive of the columns is intensely plastic. The wide staircase, channeled by a double balustrade, seems to burst in waves into the room. This superbly architectural concept is repeated even more dramatically in his sketches for the fortifications. Michelangelo spent much of his time on these designs when he was appointed governor for the defense of the city, the most anguishing period of his life. In spite of firmly held Republican views, Michelangelo was alarmed by political events and escaped to Ferrara and then to Venice. He was officially banished from Florence as a deserter and rebel. A few months later, the city was besieged, and having been granted a pardon, Michelangelo returned and behaved courageously. But Florence surrendered, and Michelangelo went into hiding as he witnessed the Medici's return to power. In 1534, Michelangelo left Florence forever for Rome. Here he formed a friendship with the young Roman nobleman Tommaso de' Cavalieri. Michelangelo produced a series of drawings for him, among them The Fall of Phaethon, in several versions. The subject was the mythological hero, punished by Jupiter for his presumption. We notice the magnificent archers. The series also included Three Labors of Hercules and Bacchanal of the Cupids. Michelangelo was certainly one of the most fertile draftsmen of his time. We see here his study of a nude from the back. At 61, Michelangelo began to paint the Last Judgment, the Dies Irae, in the Sistine Chapel. This great work reassumed all aspects of his previous creation and anticipated the work to come. Breaking once and for all with the traditional figurative style, Michelangelo conceived Christ as a supreme figure of inexorable judgment. Judgment which even the pity and the mercy of the imploring Madonna cannot sway. Christ's threatening right hand sets in motion a wheeling mass of bodies which bursts through the entire composition of over 300 figures. The space is composed of masses of bodies, revolving in perpetual movement, desperate and abandoned. Here, Michelangelo's fervor transforms into urgent religious zeal. It was a time when the Catholic Church looked for defense against the reforms of Luther. The serene idea of man as master of his destiny is transformed into the dramatic concept of man crushed by the will of God. Overriding terror and anguish spare neither the saints, we see Saints Peter and Paul, nor the martyrs themselves with the symbols of their martyrdom, St. Catherine of Alexandria with the wheel. St. Lawrence with the gridiron, and St. Sebastian with the arrows. Into mankind's tragic finale, Michelangelo has stamped his portrait on the skin of St. Bartholomew, the martyr who was flayed alive. Up on high, angels triumphantly bear the symbols of the Passion, the column of the flagellation, the crown of thorns, and the cross. In the center, the angels of the Apocalypse call the dead to judgment. On the left, the painful elevation up to God. On the right, the helpless plunge to perdition. Below we see Charon, the ferryman, who has crossed the river Styx, bearing his cargo of damned souls to hell, where Minos awaits to deliver judgment. The Last Judgment is Michelangelo's expression of his own religious experience, and a philosophy according to which everyone is guilty. Yet, everyone is offered the chance of redemption. With this colossal fresco of about 2,000 square feet, Michelangelo opened up a totally new range of vision. It not only presented a religious interpretation of life, but changed the figurative language of his time. He had achieved a new way of seeing in terms of painting, whose new standard of beauty reached a perfect correspondence between deformity in anatomy and proportion and the tormented writhing of the figures, which originally were totally nude. Vasari tells us that when the Last Judgment was about 3/4 painted, the Pope came to see it, accompanied by a group of prelates. Among these was the powerful master of ceremonies of the papal court, Biagio da Cesena, who judged the fresco as extremely dishonest. He even declared it intolerable that all those nudes should exhibit their shame in a place so sacred. Michelangelo immediately decided to use Biagio for the figure of Minos, because, as Vasari tells us, he had dared to make these accusations, and was presumptuous enough to judge the work. But in the end, it was Biagio's side who won. 30 years later, all the shames exhibited by the figures were painted over, and the painter who did the job, Daniele da Volterra, was forever labeled with the term braghettone, which means a breeches maker. The last word, however, must lie with Goethe, who wrote, "With Michelangelo, you can only look and contemplate, never judge." Immediately following the Last Judgment, Michelangelo was commissioned by Paul III to paint the frescoes in the Pauline Chapel. They represent the crucifixion of St. Peter and the conversion of St. Paul. The master was then 67 years old. The The two subjects are normally identified with two important stages in his later life: his intimate friendship with the aristocrat Vittoria Colonna and a deeply felt attachment to religion, though both these experiences go back to the time of the Last Judgment. Michelangelo's expression in the Pauline frescoes followed directly on from the Last Judgment. But here he achieved an amazingly radical style, which carried mass and volume to the utmost exaltation. In his Pauline frescoes, Michelangelo was so totally conscious of his own time, he achieved a new art that was even more instinctive, more tormented, and as a result, more in tune with the spirit of the later 16th century. Michelangelo abandoned painting altogether when the Pauline chapel was finished. Vasari explains this by telling us that working with fresco is no art for an old man. In fact, all fresco work has to be painted in the short time it takes for the plaster to dry. The stature of the aging master had now become portentous and revolutionary. This is borne out by the series of pietas he created for himself, like the one known as the Palestrina Pietà. Now that he was free from the whims and wishes of patrons, judgment by his contemporaries no longer concerned him. Michelangelo listened only to the impulse of his soul, now ridden with anxiety in the face of death and salvation. Abandoning all idea of physical beauty, he created the Pietà, now in Florence Cathedral, which originally he wanted placed on his tomb. Thereafter, the idea of death became one with the idea of art. His former fascination with the beauty he'd wrestled with so long was now transformed into longing for the serene ecstasy he'd searched for all his life, as we see in the Rondanini Pietà in Milan. The two figures are fused in a single block, animated by a simultaneous upward and downward movement. By the light of a candle attached to the brim of his hat, Michelangelo worked on it up to his very last days. He was nearly 90 when he died, in February 1564. There are various reasons why Michelangelo left a number of his works unfinished. Flaws in the marble or lack of time, for instance. Sometimes it was due to his own dissatisfaction, but more often because his patron had second thoughts, as with the captives intended for the tomb of Julius II. All art critics have given the question serious consideration. Here are some explanations. Michelangelo's unfinished works, such as the St. Matthew, stop at the stage where the image has already been totally expressed, leaving any finishing off superfluous. Or else the unfinished look results from his conviction that liberating the figure from the block of stone would nullify evidence of the creative process, as we see in the bust of Christ. Or else, it may be that Michelangelo stopped work at the point where the image already expresses his urge to reconcile form and matter. It was to architecture, the most abstract of the arts, that Michelangelo devoted most of the last 20 years of his life. In 1546, Paul III commissioned him to complete the Farnese Palace, begun 30 years before by San Gallo. To break the rigorous succession of windows along the facade, Michelangelo cut a large opening in the center, adding 2 green marble columns to emphasize a sense of depth. He designed a monumental coat of arms in stone to be placed above it, and crowned the entire palace with its massive cornice. In 1561, Pope Pius IV commanded him to build a new city gate. It was to serve as a decorative backdrop for the street leading up from the Quirinal Square. The Porta Pia, as the gate is called, was conceived as a unified structure, as well as a scenographic device to focus the perspective. The outer facade of Michelangelo's project was never built. The one we see today dates from the 19th century. It's by Vespignani, who largely ignored Michelangelo's original design. While the Porta Pia was under construction, Michelangelo was also asked to transform part of the massive ruins of the Baths of Diocletian into Santa Maria degli Angeli. Here, the aging master's main concern was in preserving the monumental character of the ancient building. Unfortunately, his work was all but annihilated by subsequent changes to the church, particularly by Vanvitelli's 18th century modifications, which swung the main axis around by 90 degrees. In his attempt to concentrate interest on the Roman building, Michelangelo was eager to incorporate some of the surrounding areas, like the Hall of Hot Baths, the Calidarium. But Michelangelo's work as an architect found its maximum expression in the design and construction of St. Peter's, as well as his new urbanistic plan for the capital. As we see in this print, the capital had become a bare little hill, almost completely abandoned, except for the imposing medieval church of Araceli and the 15th century Senator's Palace. Behind the palace stretched the valley of the Roman Forum, then known as the Campo Boario, because it was used for grazing cows. To the west of the Forum stood the Tabularium, the state archives of ancient Rome, which was incorporated into the Senator's Palace during the late Middle Ages. Today, the famous statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius is missing from the square, as it's still under restoration. We see it in this photograph. The statue had already occupied the center of the open square. Michelangelo only made the base. Michelangelo conceived the piazza as widening out from the central statue in the form of a trapezium, bordered by the 3 palaces. He linked the piazza to the rest of the city by a broad monumental ramp, the Cordonata, which gradually opens out as the visitor walks effortlessly up the gently inclined slope. On reaching the top, the visitor is immediately struck by the reversed perspective created by the considerable divergence of the 2 lateral palaces, the Museum Palace and the Palace of Conservators. Both buildings contain one of Italy's most important collections of ancient sculpture. Here, the architectural order of broad, flattened pilasters, known as paraste, form what is now called the Giant Order. Another element in the piazza complex is the magnificent double-ramped stairway leading up to the main entrance of the Senator's Palace. There were to be many imitations of this stairway, and particularly of its handsome balustrades. This is how the steps would have looked had they been built exactly according to Michelangelo's design. In any case, the expressive power of these great flights of steps is more than enough to outweigh their shortcomings. In spite of the fact that the facades of all three palaces were built after Michelangelo's death, they reflect a unique grasp of urban planning and a superb orchestration of the architectural components. The way the piazza opens out towards the town centre creates an axiality which also involves the incomparable view across the eternal city. The construction of St. Peter's occupied almost all of Michelangelo's last years. The time he dedicated to this great basilica is one of the most sublime periods of his life's work. Michelangelo was so intensely aware of his religious commitment that he refused any form of payment. The bold, gigantic dome was only built 25 years after his death. Even though the semi-spherical form Michelangelo gave it was heightened to some extent, it still reflects the model left by the master. For the new St. Peter's, Michelangelo designed an immense, powerful structure, articulated by the giant order of pilasters and its vast surfaces, animated by niches and huge windows. An absence of horizontal lines promotes the upward thrust to the superb attic. Above the building, 150 feet high, Michelangelo raised the drum with its motive of paired columns. Upon the drum rears the gigantic dome, its soaring curves emphasized by 16 stone ribs. The paired column motif reappears on a reduced scale around the lantern. Like Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, St. Peter's dome consists of two shells, one perfectly semi-spherical inside and an outer shell with the curves raised to a semi-oval. This painting shows the church as Michelangelo designed it. That is, with the dome visible from all sides. When the basilica was completed, the view of the dome was blocked on the facade side by Carlo Maderno, when he lengthened Michelangelo's Greek cross plan, the area in yellow, into a Latin cross. Michelangelo's spatial image also suffers in the interior by the addition of the first three arches of the nave. But these three arches make the church the largest in the world, 690 feet long. However, we only need to walk past the third pilaster to get a faithful reading of the building Michelangelo designed. In the interior, the master expressed his passion for unified spaces. His overall vision of St. Peter's emphasizes the intrinsic harmony between his exterior and interior space. It seems as though Michelangelo had hollowed out his material to bring all the plastic and spatial values to life and orchestrate them on the grandest scale. He emphasized the vertical lines leading up to the transept in order to guide the eye to the grandest theme, the ever-present dome. With absolute freedom of composition, Michelangelo organized all the plastic components in a single organism. Its elements rise in crescendo to an apotheosis of the mighty dome. In fact, the entire building is epitomized in the dome, where it's brought to a triumphant conclusion. Below on earth, the tomb of the apostle. Soaring above it, we have the epilogue in heaven, the dome, a symbol of the celestial vault.